Without objection, Senator from Kansas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. This past Saturday, I got to spend the whole morning with the East Central Kansas Model T Club back home. I even got to take a joyride in a 1921 Model T. Among many stories, I learned Americans were paying only 21 cents a gallon when this car was made. And it wasn't until 1975, 54 years later, that gas had doubled from that price, jumping from 39 to 53 cents. 54 years it took to double. I don't have to remind anyone that thanks to our president's energy policies and his reckless spending, he accomplished a doubling in less than 2 years. As we all know, gas is now over $5 a gallon, if you can believe it or not. We're seeing record prices and have gone now 16 days in a row without a single downtick. And this is why I'm here today to ask for unanimous consent to pass the Gas Prices Relief Act, which would bar any federal agency from finalizing any rule or regulation that would make it harder to produce American fuels. My legislation would send the right signal to American producers and investors. It would show them that the Congress sees the problem and that we're ready to address it. It would set us on a course to bring down prices at the pump, not with more reckless spending and more regulations, but by getting out of the way of American production and allowing them to power the world without more needlessly restrictive rules. With this more than doubling of price, many families back home are telling me they're paying $50 up to $100 a week more for gasoline. And that's $200 to $400 a month in case you're adding it up. And on top of that, their monthly utility bills have doubled. Now, I'm sure this administration will propose more reckless spending to fix that problem too. Unfortunately, Bidenflation is impacting many Kansas families to the tune of $600 to $700 a month. That's over $7,000 a year. Now, why the increase, you might ask? Now, I'm not an economist, but it looks to me like if you increase the regulations on a process, on a business, that's a surefire way to decrease the supply. And as we all know, our president and his policies are ramping up regulations at every step of the American oil and gas business, all the while begging for help from other nations. Indeed, he's fulfilling his campaign promises to destroy American oil and gas. Now, one more thought. As history teaches us, along with reckless spending, energy is always a leading indicator of inflation. If we don't get our arms around this energy crisis and reckless spending, we'll never slow down inflation. But it appears our president and his party disagree with this, or else simply stated they don't care. Or maybe they want these high prices. It just seems like yesterday I was filling my truck up back home for less than $2 a gallon, and now again it's over $5 a gallon across most of the nation. Rising energy prices add inflationary pressure to everything. It's like a game of dominoes. When the diesel fuel powering our 18-wheelers are costing truckers 80% more than it did last year, they're going to have to pass on that rate to their consumers. When businesses are paying 30% more for their gas utilities, they're going to have to raise their prices to make up the difference. And Kansans already paying more just to get to the store are continually finding that what money they have left is getting them less and less every week. You don't fix this supply and demand problem of this nature with price controls or artificial subsidies or more reckless spending. In reality, this is not very complicated. You could fix it by decreasing demand or increasing supply. Now, demand, unfortunately, is not decreasing, which is why we need this regulatory holiday in order to set American energy free. On some level, the administration knows this, and hence their knee-jerk decision to release 1 million barrels of oil from our Strategic Petroleum Reserve every day, reportedly without initially coordinating in a meaningful way with our partners overseas. Obviously, 1 million barrels a day won't cut it. In 2021, the United States consumed roughly 20 million barrels of oil a day. This release is truly a drop in the bucket. The administration knows that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve releases are purely cosmetic to try to convince the American people that they have solutions while they run off to beg foreign dictators and terrorists to produce more oil. Instead of looking within, instead of creating more American jobs, high-paying jobs, producing the cleanest fuel in the world, they continue their full frontal assault on American production and seek to enrich our enemies like Venezuela and Iran. But there's been a lot of talk on the left that they're not interfering with oil and gas production in the United States. These claims are simply untrue. On the campaign trail, President Biden promised to end the leasing of oil and gas production on federal lands. And as Climate Czar recently said, the administration, quote, remains absolutely committed to not moving forward with additional drilling on public lands, end quote. Most presidents brag when they fulfill a campaign promise, but apparently not when the results are this bad. It's hard to imagine that this is not all by design. This administration is getting exactly what they want. In the president's own words, the world is currently going through a, quote, incredible transition, end quote. And he thinks we will, again, I quote, be stronger and the world will be stronger and less reliant on fossil fuels when this is over, end quote. Well, the obvious question then is this: when will it be over? The Department of Energy has estimated that demand for oil and gas will increase through 2050. Now, that's a simple fact. Yet we have a president who's perfectly willing to inflict pain on the people who elected him to force his climate policies, his costly climate policies, and ignore the economic reality that the American people are facing. Now, why else would he propose a budget that gets rid of key tax provisions for the oil and gas industry? Why else would he promote policies that will make it more difficult and more expensive to drill? Does anyone think that these policies are going to help the American people? Let's talk about the stream of bad policies causing the crippling uncertainty that is making American producers hesitant to increase drilling. Last November, the EPA started the process of updating methane regulations. While the proposed rule they put forward was criminally devoid of any details, their intent was clear: an increase in costly regulations that will harm the oil and natural gas industry, ruin small producers out of business, and further increase energy costs. On February 18th, by a completely partisan vote, FERC issued and made immediately effective 2 new policy statements that would have had disastrous implications for pipeline development in the U.S. Pipelines critical to getting that oil to American consumers. Their off-the-deep-end proposal would have potentially put pipeline operators on the hook for mitigating the emissions of the end user of the product they transport. In other words, to get approval to build a pipeline, operators could have been forced to develop and pay for a way to mitigate the emissions caused by Americans driving to work every day, or perhaps by Americans heating their homes or cooking their breakfast. Thankfully, in the face of a fierce outcry from opponents on both sides of the aisle, they've temporarily pulled these changes back for further consideration, though that likely has more to do with the upcoming nomination process, the renomination process for FERC Chairman Glick, than it does with good energy policy. On March 21st, the SEC followed suit and proposed a rule that would require companies to disclose climate emission data, including greenhouse emissions caused by their suppliers and their customers. This would require companies to calculate and disclose the emissions for how everyday Americans use their products, all in an effort to make doing business with American oil and gas producers seem even more risky and less deserving of financing. And finally, an issue that's at the top of mind of many producers in Kansas right now: the Fish and Wildlife Service is poised to list the lesser prairie chicken as a threatened species. This in despite of the incredible work being done by conservationists that have made the lesser prairie chicken better protected now than ever. If the Fish and Wildlife Service goes through with this classification, it would have serious consequences for oil and gas producers in Kansas and severely limit their ability to increase production, not to mention the impact it will have on our utilities. Madam President, once again, let me state, these reasons and more are why I'm here today to ask for unanimous consent to pass the Gas Prices Relief Act, which would bar any federal agency from finalizing any rule or regulation that would make it harder to produce American fuels. Our legislation would send the right signal to American producers and investors. It would show them that Congress sees the problem and that we're ready to address it. It would set us on course to bring down prices at the pump by getting out of the way and releasing American production, allowing them to power the world without more needlessly restrictive rules and regulations. Good energy policy will fix the current crisis, not more reckless spending. Now, thank you, Madam President. But before I yield, I'd like to turn the floor over to the senator from Montana for his thoughts on the record gas prices we're facing and the need to pass our Gas Price Relief Act.